years. And how has the run been with the party?
The BJP is the most successful and the largest party in the world for a reason. It stands for certain principles, and these are close to my heart. This is the only party that espouses consciously at virtually every meeting the mantra that nation first, party second, self last. Now this makes it unique among Indian parties, and there are other aspects which also make it unique. It's a party that is working for the country's benefit. It's led by, today the Prime Minister is, he's continually been the most popular political leader in India for a very long time, but also globally. Every month that ratings come out, polls come out, he ranks very highly. And he's succeeded in changing the image of India in these last 9 years, especially in the last 3 years. India has turned from being a country that always needed other countries' help to being a country that helps other countries, not just in the pandemic, but post-pandemic economically also. It's a party that works with a mission, and for people that are interested in public service in the genuine sense, it's a wonderful platform to work from.
Right. I'm going to ask you two questions from the answer that you just gave me about India's image, for example, that a country that helps others. We just had a very unfortunate standoff with one of our neighbors, China. What did our image do for us in that?
It's unfortunate that it had to take these confrontations and loss of life to prove to the world that this is indeed a new India that can stand up for its rights. I think it's fairly obvious to many foreign policy mavens and foreign policy watchers that the détente that existed for 45 years, there was not a bullet fired, in many ways was entirely to China's benefit. The Chinese built infrastructure on their side of the LAC. We in India didn't do anything. In fact, we've had defense ministers and others say so explicitly, and we fell far behind in the basic job of protecting our borders. The Chinese intrusion into many areas of the economy also went unfettered. So what has happened is this new India has stood up for itself. This is an India that truly believes in win-win. With the exception of 2 or 3 countries, every other nation in the world welcomes the rise of India. They see India as a benevolent, friendly, growing economic superpower that wishes to partner with them. And that's been my experience. Wherever I've been, and I've been to so many different countries as part of Track 2 delegations, as leader of Track 2 delegations, they welcome it. And so, as I said, it's unfortunate that we had to lose lives in Galwan. But both what happened in Doklam and what happened in Galwan has proven to the world that India is not a pushover, not anymore. And we certainly are not looking for confrontations, but we will not be pushed around and have our rights trampled upon.
But can we sustain a confrontation? Because, given your experience with traveling around the world and talking to people and, building alliances and stuff, does it look like that we can actually sustain a confrontation like that?
That's actually a very important question that you are asking. This is a question that needs addressing, because the China issue is problematic for the whole world. Now, in the 19 years that I spent in Parliament, at the beginning with the turn of the century, in the first few years, the China issue was like the proverbial 800-pound gorilla whose name was never taken, because they were already beginning to violate global norms and rules, even though they had benefited from these very rules of global commerce, trade, and the norms of geopolitics. But it took a few years more for the world to start calling out China and its aggression. You've seen Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. You've seen it with all their neighbors, with Japan, with the Philippines, with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with us, of course, and their growing footprint. So this is an issue that concerns the entire world. We have proven that we will stand up to aggression against us. Now, the whole world is looking at China with caution. Now, China in the last 3 decades had become the source of the supply chains on which most countries became reliant. Now, we were the first country to start taking steps in our own interest, such as banning TikTok, such as making sure that Chinese investments, while they are welcome normally into India, they should not be used to undermine India's strategic positions in any way.
But our trade balance, sir, remains vastly skewed in favor of China. Despite everything, it has even grown post Galwan, which is paradoxical.
The reason for that is this trade imbalance is based on a momentum of many decades. Now, you turn the clock back to 1980, when both of us were very young. I was certainly. I don't know, you may not have even been born. But the reality is that at that time, the per capita incomes were similar. And we let that ship sail. We wasted decades not doing the things necessary, not making India Atmanirbhar, when China went far beyond in terms of economic growth and later on in military growth. And so this trade imbalance has existed. Earlier, in an earlier question, I answered that the détente which lasted for 45 years without a bullet being fired was mostly to their advantage. And precisely this is what happened. We created a scenario where India was not one economic market. So it was cheaper for Indian iron ore to be shipped to China, to be converted into steel and then imported back into India in finished product. Now, this is not smart, it's not rational. These are the things that have started being corrected. Now, the GST, which was implemented by this government, by the Modi government, was 20 years waiting in the wings, not happening. Now, the effects of that you're beginning to see. It took a few years first to settle down. Many of the initial teething troubles were sorted out. Now the GST has really kicked in. It's giving us 1.5 lakh crores of revenue every year. Even the states that used to complain about GST and oppose it have now become its cheerleaders. But the effects of this leading to correction of the trade imbalance will take a little more time.
All right.
So I'm not concerned that even today there is an imbalance. I'm cheered by the fact that we have taken many tough rational decisions, which other countries like UK when it comes to Chinese telecoms, or the US when it comes to certain other decisions, they are far behind us on this. And that is one of the reasons India is being more admired, that we are capable of taking difficult decisions in our own national interest, and the results will follow from it. They are following.
Right. Coming back to GST, it is often said that this government is very good at taking credit for the background work that has been done by the previous government, the two UPA governments, and wants to put all the failures, they want to dump all the failures at the doorstep of the previous ones, like be it Aadhaar or GST, whatever good has happened, we have done it. You could not do it, even though they were the UPA government schemes. What do you have to say to that?
The UPA government and its constituents need no help from us in claiming their rightful share of blame. Let me explain to you. It is not that the GST work was done and BJP took credit for it. It took enormous heavy lifting. It didn't happen in the first year of the Modi government. There were legislative setbacks, if you remember, trying to deal with the Land Acquisition Act. The heavy lifting that was done with the leadership provided by Prime Minister Modi and late Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, I have seen it. I have seen that work in Parliament. Both what you saw in the front, which was public, and all the behind the scenes working to try and negotiate a settlement. It was not easy. If anybody today claims that the work had been done and BJP just stepped in and made it happen, it was not like that at all. Now let's take Aadhaar. You've got a point that Nandan Nilekani's UID mission began in the UPA government. What happened? Two ministries in that government were at loggerheads. The Home Ministry wanted its own system. Aadhaar didn't get going. It got stuck. In fact, it kept spinning its wheels with making almost zero progress. Although the conceptualization of it was there. It was only after Prime Minister Modi came into office that Nandan Nilekani went and make a presentation to him that this should not be seen politically, this is a good thing for the national interest, and the Prime Minister gave it his full backing. So, I mean, you can say that you conceived of an idea, but you didn't do it, just like GST didn't happen for 20 years. And then somebody else comes and says, yes, it's good for the country, we'll do it. And then you, gnash your teeth and wring your hands and say, oh, you're taking the credit. I mean, as I said, they don't need any help from us for taking their share of blame. They had enormous scams and scandals running into huge amounts, which you haven't heard of in the last 9 years in this government. So there's no comparison between what used to exist in the name of governance and what exists today.
Well, you talked about scams not being heard. Does it have something to do with the criticism that, again, lands at your doorstep, that the freedom of press is seriously under attack in India under this government?
No, not at all. Let me explain this, because again, this is an important question. This is a trope. This is a narrative that is often spun about India and especially about this government, both domestically and internationally. Let me point this out to you. When you look at freedom of press issues, we've had long-standing issues that long predate the BJP government. Don't forget the sedition cases and arrests of people that made cartoons, or young ladies that posted on Facebook.
66A, and you had proposed a private member's bill.
Indeed.
I remember that.
Now, don't forget this professor in West Bengal who has just been acquitted after 10 years of harassment. Again, I believe it was a cartoon that he posted of the West Bengal Chief Minister. I can give you examples from Odisha. I can give you examples from many other states, from Andhra Pradesh. On the national stage, you will often find many people day in, day out complain that there is lack of freedom of speech, while pointing fingers at the government. On TV channels, on internet platforms, while making blatant accusations against the government which can't be backed up, they keep saying that there's no freedom of press. So this is a trope that goes around. It's just unfortunate.
Right. So you wouldn't agree that there is anything to be concerned about?
Our freedom of speech was amended in the term of the very first Prime Minister himself.
Yes.
And we have a legacy that goes back to those dates, and with guarantees ensured by both legislation as well as Supreme Court judgments. And nobody can take that away from us. Those constraints were put in place in the first government, the first parliament of independent India, and they're still there. Now, we have seen a situation today where foreign newspapers and magazines, when they want to appoint an India correspondent, openly advertise looking for hostile people, those who would be hostile to the government, not neutral, hostile. You know who I'm referring to. Now, it's unfortunate because many traditional media, even internationally, today have links to agencies and countries which they ought to be ashamed of. And they have no problem being hypocritical about it and pointing fingers at India. So I think India does a far better job on freedom of speech than most other countries today.
But are we setting a standard? Because to say that, oh, we are better than ABC, that's not an absolute standard that we are upholding, are we?
No, I agree that our freedom of speech, as exemplified in the Constitution, as exemplified in the laws passed, as per many High Court and Supreme Court rulings, ought to be implemented in fairness. It hasn't always happened. And you know what happens is, there are unfortunately people who masquerade as journalists and they do all kinds of things. You've had examples of people masquerading as journalists but actually running extortion rackets, actually running other kinds of criminal activities. And when they get called out, they try to take shelter against under freedom of speech rules. Yet you've had real journalists who are out there on major platforms being arrested in Maharashtra a couple of years ago, for instance, for weeks on very vague and specious charges. I don't see the same kind of outrage. I think this outrage is ideologically motivated and politically motivated. That if there is any problem, it ought to be viewed with the same lens. Whether it happens in Mumbai or it happens in Uttar Pradesh or it happens in Odisha, one should view it with the same lens. That doesn't happen. And I put that up to the critics to say that first, set your own house in order, be non-hypocritical about any abuses of freedom of speech that you see. Only then will people take you seriously.
But the state is bigger than people or its critics. So I think the state has to go that step ahead and set a very sort of unbiased kind of barometer.
The
for assessing
problem
these
is,
things.
the problem is, if a media house gets caught in an ED investigation because of forex violations, people point fingers saying that this is an abuse of freedom of speech. You are trying to squelch their voice. Now, you can't have it both ways. You can't be in blatant violation of laws, whether it is money laundering laws, whether it is other laws that exist on the book, and then you can't claim protection because you are a media house. Now, you have to abide by the rules of the country. You can't be raising funds in the name of charity and using it for personal purposes, not paying income tax, and claim that you are a journalist who's being harassed. Now, these are the kinds of examples that are pointed out against the government. What about all the other journalists that I've pointed out in all these other states which are not run by the BJP? Why aren't these same questions being asked about them often enough? So that's what I'm saying. We must look at freedom of speech issues on principle and based on a neutral lens, not on an ideological or a political lens.
When it comes to, forget about freedom of speech or media houses, but when it comes to law, and the way the state implements its laws, do you think that there is absolute fairness that your party, your government exercises?
I think I know what you're aiming at. Now, we've had decades of governments following appeasement policies where lawbreakers were given free rein. Now, what is happening is when they are no longer being given free rein, there seems to be all kinds of reaction that, oh, you are harassing them. Now, in the Delhi riots of 2 or 3 years ago, you had a section of the media try to paint it as if it was government harassment of one section of society. Yet, in the days leading up to the riots in Delhi, we saw the vandalism, we saw the arson, the violence that was taking place. We saw people throwing stones and cops chasing after them, and yet some sections of the media reporting only about the cops chasing after them and not about the violence that took place before the cops chased after them. So this kind of prejudiced lens is not bought by the people. These sections of the media have been trying to make this allegation, especially against this government, and it's not being bought by the people. It's not being bought by the people because it lacks genuineness. It lacks that neutral viewpoint that media should have. And if media is itself ideological, if media is batting for certain sections of the political spectrum, if media is in bed with certain political players, you know, everything will feel unfair to them when the law is applied to them. And you know, we have enough protections in our constitution. We have enough protections in our judicial system. We have enough protections by way of public opinion that these rights are protected.
When it comes to Delhi riots, you said that there was a certain lobby that would paint the picture in a certain way. But when you look at the number of casualties, fatal casualties, the number of a particular community are disproportionately higher than the other.
Look, I don't want to go into
pure numbers and official records here.
So, look, I could go into the proportion of casualties in relation to the proportion of the general population. I don't think that would be a very pleasant discussion because it will disprove some of these allegations that are being made. Now, the media often has a standpoint that only casualties of certain sections of society seem to bother them, whereas casualties of other sections of society don't seem to bother them. Now, I have seen some sections of media and some alleged journalists take a stand in favor of the very same people who tortured and killed a government officer during who first captured him, tortured him for a long time and killed him. I have seen journalists and certain sections of media try to downplay the fact that arms, armaments and fuel were being organized on the rooftop of a particular lawmaker to set, to get arson going. Now, you can't downplay these events. Of course, every death is unfortunate.
Absolutely.
And anybody who's an Indian who suffers either injury or death, it's absolutely regrettable. But again, you must be very clear that you can't be taking a very soft stand against people who are inciting violence, saying we will cut off the northeast of India and urging people to go there and commit violence. You're taking a soft stand on that. And yet when violence actually happens, you paint them as the victims. That's not acceptable.
But what happens when words are equated with actions? Because words don't cause violence, violence causes violence.
This is a very interesting thing. This is the very distinction between freedom of speech and sedition. The classical definition is that my right to extend my hand stops before it touches your nose.
Absolutely.
Right? That's action. But my being abusive of you is not violence. The reality is that we have seen under that guise actual abuse and actual violence happen. For example, there have been people that have been arrested who have been instigating revolt against the state through speeches, through articles, but more importantly, through actually acting as messengers for the Naxalites, for carrying guns and armaments for the Naxalites, and taking shelter under freedom of speech rules. Many of them are still fighting legal cases. Now, you can apply that standard of freedom of speech, but even in the gold standard anywhere in the world, the freedom of speech ends where it looks like it is translating into action. So if you are actually fomenting violence, and you can say that, okay, it's just a speech, but then thereafter you do see the violence on the ground, then you can't distance the two from each other.
About Naxalism, I cannot but ask you about this whole Bhima Koregaon thing, and charges are yet to be proved. Cases are still sub judice. Nothing has come out as yet. How does a regular citizen of this country then have faith in the state or its judicial processes?
So, it would be not fair to just go into one such case, because then it has to be seen in the context of many other cases. The Indian judicial system does have its flaws, and that needs to be reformed. The process of adjudicating itself, I mean, cases take decades. The administrative system is such that investigators get transferred after every few years. And if a case takes 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the degree of efficiency of any investigation will suffer. I have myself been a proponent of reforms. Now, this is not an isolated case. This by itself doesn't make it a non-viable case. Many cases that have taken a long time have also led to real serious judgments, and people have ended up getting convicted. We must take this seriously. Just because the system is inefficient, we can't either throw our hands up and say, hey, there must be if the system is inefficient, you must let these people go. There must be a presumption of innocence, of course.
Absolutely.
But we must. But presumption of innocence does not mean that the effort to prosecute them and investigate them, when the Naxalite problem is not to be made light of. I come from a state where thousands of people have died. They have been killed, they have been kidnapped, they have been tortured, they have been ransomed by Naxalites. And people that have sympathies for the Naxalites, who want to overthrow the state, while they may have a certain freedom to express their opinions, if they are involved in more than just opinions, if they are involved in inciting or facilitating that movement, then they are certainly accountable by the laws of India. Having said that, we do need to streamline our system, but it's not it's easier said than done. Streamlining the system is not just a governmental decision that can be done with a stroke of a pen.
Right.
Now, you've seen the whole issue about judicial appointments. We have the only system in the world where judges appoint judges. Okay? And a very wonderful legislation was passed unanimously 10 years ago, the National Judicial Appointments Commission. It was done unanimously. It involved leaders from all parties to come together, and it was modeled on something that's very successfully done in the UK, where there are checks and balances, where the judiciary plays a very key role in the appointments. But government also has a role and civil society has a role. That was struck down. It's very unfortunate, I think, in my personal opinion. So we need to look at the whole thing holistically, that we need to sort out our judicial tanglements and improve it in all, not just for Naxalites and people facing sedition charges, but simple commercial agreements in India are not as watertight as they ought to be.
Yeah.
That itself affects daily life.
Right. Odisha, Naxalism, something similar, what we saw many years ago happening in Naxal-infested areas seems to be getting replicated in Kashmir. And I pose this question to you because you also have been involved in matters of Kashmir. This arming villagers, creating these private militias to resist the attacks from the militants. Do you think it's a wise decision?
First of all, I would request you to not call them militants. Please call them by their correct
terrorists.
Terrorists.
Yes.
And now this is important.
Yes.
Because words matter. We tried, we sometimes end up either willingly or inadvertently legitimizing violence by giving nicer names to those who are in fact just terrorists, right?
Yes.
Now, I was on the Home Committee of Parliament and have visited Kashmir a couple of times, in fact many times, and have gone there in other capacities also, and I have met. My view is that the vast majority of people in Jammu and Kashmir are proud to be Indian, they're happy to be Indian. It was also my view that we had an odd set of circumstances, that people who were undermining the state, undermining the constitution, playing footsie with terrorists were actually officially getting funded by the state. It was a bizarre situation. I couldn't understand it as an Indian from another part of the country, going and saying, how is it possible that the state is actually writing checks to these people who are doing these kind of things? So we have had a terribly contorted, terribly irrational situation for many decades that is getting unwound gradually. I went and spoke at Oxford University shortly after Section 370 was abrogated, and I talked about how a lot of people who tried to take a stand against India weren't even aware that without the abrogation of Section 370, many progressive Indian laws were not applicable in Kashmir. The laws of equality of the genders, the laws of non-discrimination against Dalits, women's rights for inheritance, all sorts of laws were not applicable. Now,
there were versions of these laws there in the
no, in fact, I personally know people that were of Kashmiri origin who were women whose inheritance rights were affected because they chose to marry outside Kashmir. So it's not a glib thing to say that there were some versions of it. There was not. I can show you actual examples of Dalits who were disbarred from getting any other jobs other than as janitors.
Yes.
So no, it was not the case. Now, this problem will, to get it unwound, it does require one fundamental issue, which is that we have cross-border terrorism. We know it. Everybody knows it.
Absolutely.
We know that there are terror camps across the LOC. And for the first time, the nuclear bluff was called with the surgical strikes and the airstrike at Balakot. Now, despite all that, there are some motivated people across the border, and there are some terrorists who are still trying to stoke violence. Now, all our capabilities need to be enhanced. Our police capability needs to be enhanced, our intelligence capabilities need to be enhanced. Most importantly, the economic growth that is being envisioned for Jammu and Kashmir. We are beginning to see the glimmers of it. Today, if you see the comparisons of how much Jammu and Kashmir has progressed compared to the other side of the LOC, you are seeing disenchantment on the other side as well. So I'm hopeful about this.
No, I asked you this question about arming the villagers. Is it a wise thing to do in Jammu and Kashmir, because it is already one of the most militarized regions in the country, in the world even, and then giving people arms and training, are we not replicating Selva Judum there in a way?
You know, without going into comparisons with Salwa Judum, when you say that there are a lot of arms there, the Indian protective forces cannot be in every village. They cannot be in every localized area. And yet, the terrorists are targeting vulnerable people. They are especially targeting the Pandit community. But they are targeting also anybody who wants to take part in democracy. They are targeting people of all religions, all communities who are taking part in elections.
I'm glad you said that, because it just seems that when it comes to Muslims, people just tend to underplay how they have also been victims of this kind of this slew of terror attacks over 4 decades almost.
Yes, but and of course that's terrible. As I said, any Indian who is a victim of any kind of violence is not something that we should tolerate. The difference is, of course, that the Kashmiri Pandits have been eliminated altogether. There has been genocide, and there are hardly any Kashmiri Pandits left in Kashmir. That is the difference. Now, the reality is people are asking for arms. You have seen women actually go on TV saying that I deserve to have a government authorization or a permit to carry arms because my relatives, I think her son or her husband was killed, who came on TV. So you should ask this question to her. You should ask this question, why are you asking for arms even though your husband and son have been killed? Why don't you let it be, and why doesn't things resolve by themselves? So we do have provisions in law to give licenses for arms in circumstances where people are threatened. You and I, if we are under threat, we can ask for an arms license and we can get it. Why shouldn't somebody in Kashmir have the same privilege when they actually face hostility and violence virtually every day?
Isn't there then danger of these particular weapons falling in wrong hands?
Look, this is, to my mind, a very odd argument, because the real problem of weapons is far greater than authorized, licensed firearms to be given to Indian citizens. The real problem is cross-border smuggling of weapons through the cross-border terrorist activities that are sponsored by Pakistan and its agencies. That's a far bigger problem. Now, this is a problem of vulnerable people, Indian citizens, who are demanding arms to be able to protect themselves because they recognize that the Indian armed forces can't be everywhere all the time, despite a large presence. So I think it would be cruel to deny them that right, and you really should do a follow-up interview with that lady who is on TV asking for arms.